really feel special.
You mentioned suit of armor a couple of times, and in a way that sounds like a good thing to me, but in a way I wonder if there's a double-edged sword to that. I mean, the fact that you need to understand just how important that you are and that you have rights and you have the value that other people have. I see that. And yet, most people don't have to fight to make sure that everybody else understands that. And society doesn't step in my way to be able to convince people of that. There's a cost to that, especially for a 19-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 5-year-old little girl.
Well, not if you're supported. I mean, we had so much support. I went home almost every weekend to a loving family, to a loving community. I was treated as a celebrity. I met Martin Luther King one day, and I was so excited to be meeting him but before I could get out of my mouth how proud I was of his leadership, he was telling me how proud he was of me and what Hamilton and I were doing at the University of Georgia.
If I might, do you remember that moment when you first saw him and realized you know who he is and you get to talk to him? You remember that moment?
I remember that moment. I mean, that was, over almost 50 years ago, or maybe more. But he was walking down a street in Atlanta, which was then the great black business hub, bustling Sweet Auburn, they called it, because of so many good black businesses doing well. And all of a sudden I looked up there and I saw him and I realized who it was. And that's when I've never been shy.
Really?
No. I bounded up to him and I said, "Hello, Dr. King, I'm sure." And before I could even get my name out, he had said, "Oh, my dear, I know who you are." I mean, that was such was his own generosity and understanding. And it was just a brilliant moment. And I never really did get to say anything about how proud I was of him because, in a way, when we talk about suit of armor, I mean, there was Martin Luther King saying how important it was for Hamilton and me to be doing what we were doing and how important education was. But in the book that I wrote about the whole experience, In My Place, I talked about how we inherited that layer of armor from our grandparents. I mean, my grandfather used to tell his son, my father, "Son, get an education because education is the key to our liberation." And when I spoke about Martin Luther King and his legacy here in Minneapolis, one of the things I said is that, there's an old Haitian proverb that goes "Deyeman Geman," which means beyond the mountain, more mountains. And even though we achieved a lot, I mean, after Hamilton and I desegregated University of Georgia, the entire system of segregated schools from college on down to elementary school collapsed by the following fall. But when we look around the United States today, I come back here from Africa, which many people call the third world. We now refer to it as the developing world in the new, more politically correct vernacular.
Does it ever feel that we shine that up? Like we shine up so many things and try to turn it into something that it isn't, or at least the perception of what it isn't?
Well, I mean, the point is that I was about to make, though, is that I come back to America and I hear the candidates and I hear people in education talking about what a shambles American education is in, particularly in the inner city. And when I hear some of the stories, it's not a whole lot different from some of the experiences that I have in Africa, where you go, even in South Africa, which is the most advanced of the economies on the continent. Schools opened a few days ago, and there were many schools in the country, which is in a real sense a first world country, but it's also a third world country because many of those schools that opened up in black areas had no books. And so you look back and you say, well, what was your experience like and what do you think you achieved? And we think we achieved a lot. But at the same time, democracy requires vigilance. And in an advanced democracy like ours, we need people to be even the lesson of this terrible condition of our schools, especially those in poor areas, is that we haven't been vigilant enough.
I think about your life after school. I mean, you could look back and say, high point, I would argue impact, yes, huge, what it is you were able to accomplish, and yet you didn't stop. I mean, you look at your life. You look at the awards that you have acquired, and maybe those are the least important, maybe. But I think they were.
I like getting awards. Don't you?
One of these days, maybe. But when you reflect back, what are the